Hello and welcome to Moderate Fantasy Violence, a podcast about pop culture and the world around it. I'm Nick.
And I'm Alistair.
And this fortnight we've been covering the full range of streaming services, with Sweet Tooth, the new comic adaptation on Netflix about a boy with antlers struggling to survive in a fairy tale-esque dystopian world based on the comic by Jeff Lemire, and then we're hopping over to Amazon for their high-concept sci-fi anthology Solos, in which a lot of very famous actors are deeply alone. But before that, Alistair, have you seen anything on any other streaming services?
Funny enough, yes, I've been watching something on Disney Plus, the streaming service not mentioned so far. So yeah, a few of you may have noticed that Marvel have put out another show. This is their third of their Disney Plus TV shows, Loki, picking up the story of the God of Mischief, played by Tom Hiddleston, from where they left him in Avengers Endgame. And yeah, I'm finding this an interesting show so far. I had high hopes for WandaVision, and it was quite good, although I also had some criticisms of it. Yeah, I think on the podcast we said that Falcon and Winter Soldier didn't feel like it was quite done when it came out of the oven. So middling expectations for Loki, and so far it's managed to exceed my expectations. It's difficult to tell when you're only 2 episodes in. The cast is very good. They've got Owen Wilson, who's obviously mainly does Hollywood films and comedies, so he's quite, I think, a high profile get for Marvel TV show, and he's got very good banterous relationship with Tom Hiddleston, very much of the sort of weary banter side. Owen Wilson's quite soft-spoken, kind of a real sense of kind of weary humour to what he does, so that's very good. And they've got an interesting plot in which Loki is recruited by the Time Variant Agency, a group who protect the sacred timeline from distortions, I guess the sort of distortions created by all the time travelling in Avengers Endgame. And he's been recruited by them to hunt down another variant of himself that's causing trouble, which is an interesting plot. It's got the potential for lots of twists. I always find with anything involving Loki, I kind of thought this about Thor Ragnarok, which is, at this point, it's inevitable that Loki's just going to betray anyone and everyone to get what he wants. So you are kind of sitting there waiting for the shoe to drop, waiting for Loki to pull the rug out from under you. But they do manage to make it tense and interesting, even though you are waiting for the inevitable to happen. But I guess we'll see how that plays out in the next 4 episodes.
Well, yeah, I think the thing with Loki is that he's fundamentally, people like him because he's cool and watchable and handsome and British. But the other thing is he's also, in his way, slightly weaselly and pathetic. Like, the show has to allow him to put off a few big pranks, big bits of mischief, but also has to sort of put him in his place semi-regularly. So it's a balance to pull off, and I think they more or less do it. And yeah, I think this is ahead of Falcon and Winter Soldier, mostly on sheer style. Like, I'd just rather watch Tom Hiddleston in this sort of weird time travel backdrop than I would watch Anthony Mackie and Sebastian Stan plodding around doing sort of special forces tinged superhero. It's just more fun. It's just more entertaining. I think some of the plotting issues from Falcon and Winter Soldier are still in there somewhere. Well, I don't know, issues might be a strong word, but it's basically, I want it to be a TV show, and it still feels very much like a chopped up movie so far. I was very much hoping they'd lean into this sort of working for the Time Variance Authority mismatched cop enforcement agent thing they've got going with Loki and Owen Wilson, and, have a weekly procedural plot or something. Like, maybe it's just because I've just watched the half season of Lucifer, but I thought maybe they'd actually, have a weekly time crime that they have to solve, and the ongoing and who's this evil Loki variant plot would just tick along in the background. But so far, and we are now a third of the way into the series, it looks like they're not bothering with that. It looks like they're just hammering the main plot, milking it for all the sweet juice they can get.
I agree with you that would be better. I think they should lean into the TV format a bit more. There was a time when, back in the days of Battlestar Galactica and Lost 24, when these kind of huge epic arc plots, or even just like that all-series arc plots, were kind of really exciting because it kind of meant that more could happen. You didn't have to rely on like a resolution like on every single episode. But it does feel a little bit tired now, and now we're doing like TV adaptations of film properties, in essence. Just feels like everything kind of wants to be a film, especially when it's like 6 hours. That's like not a huge amount longer than Endgame. So, again, it just feels like, and also the inevitable slow pacing of some of these Netflix shows, Netflix shows and now Disney Plus shows, means that, there is the part in the back of your head that like, look, they could just tighten this up and shat it out into the cinema. Yeah,
I just feel like there's room to do a bit more of it, especially because, as I say, it's a crime investigation setting. It's literally built to have a procedural in it. I don't understand why they're not doing this. In the same way as I never understood why they did a Daredevil series which was set in a lawyer's office, and a Jessica Jones series set in a detective agency, both of which were clearly developed in the comics so that they would generate new cases for the lawyer/detective to solve, but didn't make them procedurals, didn't actually have them really doing cases. It just seems like you're just... Anyway, I don't know. I can't make them love me, and I can't make them make the sort of TV shows I want them to make.
I just think procedurals are just... There's a conceived wisdom that they're uncool. I think it's just because, like, shows like CSI and House just flogged the format to death. Now we've had a generation that's just basically been raised on arc plot has a different perception of what would make good TV than the people making TV who are older and have kind of sat through too many tired 90s like X-Files rip-offs and have got bored of the case of the week format.
Yeah, who knows? Maybe if they did it, it would be terrible. And, you know, they have only got 6 episodes. But yeah, there's also just things like the first episode of Loki, I think, could have been the first 20 minutes of a film or the first 20 minutes of a procedural episode that actually had a plot. There was quite a lot of exposition and runaround. And, like, I think if you just chopped some of the busy work, or you could have easily fitted it in around an actual story. But again, the thing is, it's just fundamentally more entertaining than the last one was. Tom Hiddleston is just more watchable. The TVA setting, which is very cool and very well realised and kind of good placey, kind of Legion-y actually, in the way it's sort of retro.
Yeah, I really like the 60s aesthetic they've got, both in the interior design of the TVA, but also in the information videos he has to watch with this very kind of 60s infographic animation sort of style they've got going on. I'm very here for that.
Yeah, it's just more fun to watch, and that does soften a little my pain about the sometimes quite slow and quite hammering the points home repetitively plotting. I don't know if it has the potential to be one of those Marvel things where I mostly come away thinking, well, I'm glad I watched that because it's always nice to see Tom Hiddleston play Loki, but I'm not sure how much it actually did. I mean, I'm hoping that it'll, towards the back half of the series, assuming for now I'm not going to get my procedural, because it seems a lot like I'm not, it will at least go more weird and things will get stranger. You know, we'll see more time-bending stuff, we'll see more variants of Loki. No, I'm not going to spoil the ending of episode 2, but yeah, there's certainly variants of Loki around. I think we could have spoiled that much. You know, things will get a bit more strange and a bit more off-kilter.
Yeah, it's only got potential, so I think it'll be an interesting show to discuss in its entirety in 2 episodes' time.
Yep, we'll see you in 4 weeks for our longer and more comprehensive Loki coverage.
So, aside from watching Loki, Nick, what else have you been up to recently?
Well, getting as far as turning off the streaming services, but not as far as leaving the Marvel consumerverse. I have borrowed a PlayStation 4 from a friend of mine and started playing the Spider-Man PlayStation game from 2018, I believe. This is, of course, a big open-world superhero game, sort of in the vein of the later Batman Arkham games, I guess. Only obviously because it's Spider-Man, some of it actually takes place during the day, and the character that actually talks a bit more. Yeah, basically it's a long plot-based open-world game in which you swing around a massive, well-realised New York, bashing up the crims, and occasionally encountering someone who will give you a bit of exposition about the plot. I am about, according to the homepage of the game, 60% through, I think. I have been playing for a couple of weeks, and yeah, it's a lot of fun. As they always say about the best Spider-Man games, the best Spider-Man games are the ones where they get the sort of web-swinging mechanic right, and you can just have fun swinging around the city, stopping to crush the occasional person's skull, and then just seamlessly zip off again to do the next thing. It's very good like that. It's very light on its feet. You can sort of do a lot of tasks. To be honest, the parts of the game which I would criticise a little are the parts where you have to do the same task a lot, or stop to do something repetitive, or occasional forced stealth sections where you have to slow way down for ages. Like the parts that make it feel a bit less fun and quick and light on its feet. But those parts are thankfully relatively few and far between, and a lot of the time, if you don't want to do them, you can just ignore them. Like they're mostly sort of side mission bonus token stuff, where you're just doing it for extra things to get your completion percentage up. I'll definitely get to the end of the plot of this game. I'm not sure if I see myself hammering the map for every token to 100% it. But yeah, it's a lot of fun. Fundamentally, it's just good fun to play Spider-Man and swinging around doing the tasks. And the plot is enjoyably knotty so far. So far, like I'm 60% through. I've only had like one. Yes, I think only one, like, really hyped up fight with a supervillain. Actually, no, 2, sorry, there was the one at the very beginning. Yeah, 2 big fights with a known supervillain. And aside from that, it's just been a lot of, like, stunty set pieces, dodging stuff, and bashing huge amounts of henchmen, which is a surprising amount of restraint on the old supervillain front. Usually these games make up a plot where the primary function is clearly getting a row of Spider-Man villains to line up for you to, like, work through them. Sometimes more convincingly than others. Like, obviously, Batman Arkham Asylum got around this by just setting it in the Batman prison, so all the villains were already there, and it made a certain amount of sense. And in the Batman Arkham Asylum sequel, sequels. They had to make up more and more elaborate excuses why the villains were all there. But yeah, Spider-Man, they just haven't bothered, really. They've had a couple show up towards the beginning, and then we've just got a long, complex plot involving mostly just one villain, who I haven't even got to fight yet. Credit to them for showing restraint, I suppose. I'm just interested to see what, if any, other Spider-Man villains will show up.
It's interesting, yeah. I've heard good things about this game. The one question I really just got to ask is, how much of New York have they recreated virtually in this open world game? Because New York is, and I have just looked this up for the purpose of this question, 783 kilometers squared. It's pretty big. So how much of it have they recreated?
I mean, I'm not going to lie, Alistair, I'm going to have to look this up now for the purpose of answering your question.
Manhattan is a mere 59 kilometres squared.
I think it's a quarter scale of Manhattan, according to the first answer to Google. It's focused entirely on Manhattan, I think. They're not doing the entire city.
That's interesting, though. I mean, I'm glad that they've got the open world thing, because I do remember, thinking that, so Spider-Man open world thing where you could just swing around New York and, have fun as Spider-Man does sound like, obviously, just a great core concept for a game.
Yeah, it does, and it is. And I like the fact that it does actually, I made that joke about it not always being nighttime, but that is actually quite a fun part of the mechanic. Like, the days do actually go by as you play the game. Although, Spider-Man never seems to sleep. There's been one little plot development where I've had to try and go back to his flat to sleep, only to discover in typical Spider-Man fashion, he's been kicked out for not paying his rent. And then there's a little side quest where his stuff has been taken away by the bailiff, so I have to try and, chase it up. Which is quite funny.
Spider-Man kitchen sink drama.
Yeah, no, it's good. I mean, it's one of the reasons why this game is good. It does replicate a lot of that. There's been more than one occasion where the next item on my superhero checklist is head over to check in with Aunt May. And often when you get there, something just happens to happen, which also advances the Spider-Man plot, because they're using the villain Mr. Negative, who is a relatively recent one from the comics, where his gimmick is that, his secret identity is that he's the owner of a homeless shelter where Aunt May works. It turns out the owner is secretly a supervillain. So often when you check in with Aunt May, you'll also see this guy making ominous hints about his evil plans.
Yeah, that seems to work. And it's interesting that it's definitely not a villain I know from, the 3 series of Spider-Man films they've done now.
Mr. Negative, yeah. He was introduced in the comics in, I want to say, the late 2000s, maybe the very early 10s, but I think the late 2000s. He's one of these Spider-Man characters who's basically a crime boss with a gimmick, and his particular gimmick, he's drawn as basically a guy with inverted colours, and then he can sort of touch other people and turn them into corrupted, negative versions of themselves, and they're then his henchmen and stuff.
Yeah, that sounds interesting.
He's a bit of a generic fighty man, but he drives the plot pretty well. He has his connection to Aunt May, and they've got sort of Dr. Octopus vaguely loitering around in the backdrop. I'm assuming eventually he's going to veer up and bash me with his big tentacles.
Yeah, sounds like a fun game. I suppose because Spider-Man's still owned by Sony, who also own PlayStation, so this naturally makes sense.
I think that's just the movie rights, but yeah, that is certainly an interesting, I don't know if coincidence. I mean, I think this is like one of the big PlayStation exclusives, isn't it? This is one of the ones they sold a load of PlayStations off.
Yeah.
Yeah, there is also a sort of semi-sequel, I think, a sort of game 1.5, the sort of smaller game that comes between this and the inevitable sequel, Spider-Man Miles Morales, where you play as Miles. I might get to play that. And it is on PlayStation 4. It was weirdly both a launch game for PlayStation 5, and they released a slightly technically less advanced version for PlayStation 4.
I've heard good things about that game. It's supposed to be very good. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I am really enjoying the Spider-Man game, so we'll see if I get to this and desperately want more of the same.
Next up, we will be reviewing Sweet Tooth on Netflix, based on the comic by Jeff Lemire. In the aftermath of a deadly disease that wipes out almost all the people in the world, a young father retreats to the forest to raise his son Gus, a human-deer hybrid. Over a decade later, when dangerous men who hunt hybrids find Gus and his father, he needs to leave the confines of their family home and go on a journey across post-pandemic America in search of his mother, accompanied by grumpy former football player and hybrid hunter Tommy. We've seen the first series of this show. So, Nick, what did you think of it?
I thought this is a strange show with its sort of combination of dystopian bleakness and this sort of fairy tale thing, this sort of big rolling hills, a lot of focus on the cute, lovable innocence of the main character, but also everything's sad and everyone's dead and diseases and bleak science and stuff. But also, yeah, it's mostly built around what a wide-eyed, lovable innocence the main character Gus is. But to be honest, I think that's kind of what makes it work. I mean, it's hitting a lot of the dystopian tropes pretty hard. So the fact that it's got this different angle is probably the main selling point. I think it remains compelling despite the slight tropiness of it. I think the character dynamics among at least the main few characters are pretty well built. Like, there's the main two you just mentioned. There's a third one, another kid called Bear, who joins their group shortly later. And then there's a couple of other characters who the show occasionally cuts away to in subplots, which, to be honest, I thought was going to be annoying when they first introduced it, but it actually works pretty well. The episodes never seem that slow because you get a bit of every character and they will advance at least a little. I think the pacing is relatively good for a Netflix show. I don't think there's that much padding and plotting, apart from the very first episode, which maybe feels a bit originy, like it feels like it's taking a long time to very slowly get to an inevitable point. I didn't fully get into it until episode 2, but once I was into it, I think I more or less stayed into it. It's decent, it moves along at an okay pace. I don't think it's going to change anyone's life, and to bring in an MFV vocab word, I don't think it's really transcended, but I was entertained.
Yeah, I enjoyed this show overall. Yeah, it has its sort of strong emotional moments, especially towards the end and in the last episode, that really did like tug on the heartstrings. And yeah, I was invested in the characters and emotionally moved by it, so it's definitely good. Yeah, mainly because of the likeable characters and the nice dynamic between Gus and the perpetually grumpy Tommy, the perpetually positive and happy-go-lucky Gus, and later Bear's introduced, and then they kind of weave in the subplots as they go. And yeah, it has this journey structure that gives it this sense of pacing, slightly episodic structure where they can meet characters as they go on their journey. Yeah, it's a well-structured, well-put-together show. I do agree with you that I think that it's tonally a little strange. I'm not sure. It's one of the things that really kind of hard to decide. I can't tell if it's deliberate or a sort of mistake, in that the story involving Gus is very I'm a kid on a magical adventure sort of thing. And then it'll just cut to this one character who's a doctor who's basically been forced at gunpoint to like dissect kids to find a cure for the disease for a warlord who wants to conquer the world and enslave everyone. Bits involve people being burnt in their homes, or nasty people hunting hybrids. It does really tonally swerve from like light-hearted to quite dark, and it sort of goes back and forth all over the place. Like, it's not helped by a soundtrack that sounds very late aughts indie, Bella and Sebastian kind of quite happy poppy, acoustic guitar indie stuff that adds to the general light-hearted childhood innocence vibe they've got going on, punctuated by occasional moments of ultra-violence. Yeah, it's an interesting tone they've gone for.
I think it must be more or less deliberate. I think there's got to be something they're going for, this sort of lovable kids' adventure in a genuinely bleak dystopia. It's strange, but I think it at least makes the show stand out a little from, as I say, other dystopias. Like we watched called Tribes of Europa a few months ago, and that fell a lot harder into the standard dystopia trap, to be honest. That did not feel like it had as much to make it stand out as Sweet Tooth does.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you that I am quite tired of grim post-apocalyptic dystopias in both television, film, and in published science fiction as well. It is a sort of a trope I think has been flogged to death, and I did like the fact this wasn't just another grim people like struggling to survive in a world devastated by disease, that there was this kind of sense of positivity. And it had a real sort of green aesthetic in terms of like the colour palette was quite green and quite bright, and there was a lot of plants and stuff, and almost like a bit sort of solar punk, which is, for the uninitiated, solar punk is a positive inversion of cyberpunk about better futures and more environmentally friendly ones. Obviously this isn't a better future story, it's about a world after a disease has destroyed most of the world, but rather than just showing kind of like grey and destroyed buildings and everything, because it's set about 10 years or more after the apocalypse, there's lots of like plants have grown everywhere and lots of nature, so all the kind of ruined cities are covered in kind of carpets of green, which is very much the kind of solar punk aesthetic, kind of the built environment mixed with lots of plants, and there's lots of footage of people travelling across kind of green verdant hills and things like that, so which kind of contributes to the tone of it, kind of happy niceness. It's almost a bit Wizard of Oz, people on a journey through this kind of lush green landscape. I think that was certainly different, and I really liked that, and it contributed to the kind of positive tone.
Well, I think one thing that this show seems to be taking as a thesis, and this is something that I think people were kind of saying as a joke towards the start of the real pandemic we're currently living through, was like, nature is healing, humanity was the virus or something. And, there's a very real sense of a lot of what's happening with this apocalypse isn't so much bleakness as nature rebelling against the humans. And the show does often seem to be making the case that the humans kind of deserve it. Like, with the exception of the two humans in our main cast, like Tommy and Bear, a lot of the other humans kind of suck. Well, there's Amy is it Amy who runs the shelter? But yeah, the good humans count is not high. It's a general consensus that we might well be on the side of the hybrids replacing them.
Yeah, exactly. Which is what helps you to identify with Gus. It's part of the character Tommy who used to hunt hybrids. His kind of redemptive journey of him being a bad person who is now doing the right thing and the good thing by looking after this kid. But yeah, I think you're very much on the side of that, like, the humans are bad, and especially the kind of the grown-ups, young people and kids, and the hybrids are good. I think, yeah, there's almost no children in this who aren't hybrids, so I think they're obviously trying to make some kind of point there.
I mean, the humans who do appear, I mean, although I think it does subvert the tropes just about enough to make it unique and interesting. There are occasions where some of the characters who are a bit two-dimensionally tropey get a bit much. Like there's the sort of Lost Boys-esque tribe of young people wearing animal skins who turn up in the episode where they meet Bear. That was a bit, okay, you haven't really moved this far away from the standard dystopia setup, have you? And also the evil general villain. I was almost impressed how little effort they made to characterise or soften or give motivation to that character. He just kept turning up and being an evil general man with a real dedication.
Yeah, that was not particularly subtle character, post-pandemic warlord.
And I guess there was what I think was meant to be revealed towards the end, that the general man was also one of the last man hybrid hunters. So I guess that was meant to be a reveal, and that's meant to give us some motivation into why he's such a dick.
But I kind of had assumed that quite a long time before. So it didn't strike me as a revelation. They linked that up, but I suppose he's supposed to be just more of like an external antagonistic force, kind of influencing the other characters. But it's not a particularly sophisticated or original character. But there were quite a wide range of characters who were well developed and well woven into the plot. So I didn't feel let down in that regard, and I did kind of like how they did like character of the week, where someone they would meet up with along the way, like the animal lost boy children they sort of meet up with, and Bear's the only character that continues from that episode. There's an episode on a train when Tommy meets an old friend who's a character who's only in that episode. The father's only in the first episode, really. So I kind of liked how that slightly more episodic format was brought in with these kind of people they meet on their journey.
Well, yeah, I guess swinging slightly back to what I said about Loki, I liked the fact that the episodes did feel at least a bit self-contained. It didn't just feel like a chopped-up movie, and it was only 8 episodes long. So yeah, as Netflix shows go, this is not the most Netflixy of Netflix shows.
Yeah, they've definitely addressed some of the issues.
And also, apart from the very first one and very last one, I think the episodes are a nippy 40-ish minutes rather than like an hour.
Yeah, also, yeah, which was another positive. Again, maybe they're learning to not make things don't have to be long and drawn out to be good. They can tell a tight story. Which actually, yeah, there is not really much I would cut from this.
Because they've got quite a lot of characters dotted around, like they've got the Sings as well, who we haven't really mentioned. You could sort of drop in on those, on the Sings and on Amy running her shelter and on the main trio, and occasionally on the general. They advance them a little bit in all their scenes, and it feels like it's still moving along.
Yeah, a lot of those characters would get like maybe 2 scenes an episode sometimes. Like the Sings would have 2 scenes an episode, so maybe one setting up a problem they got to deal with in this episode, and the second scene resolving it and moving their story forwards. And they sort of rotated around, and then maybe the next episode you get more Sing plot and only 2 Amy scenes and so on.
And the Sings plot was pretty good, I thought. I thought it was an interesting level of sort of moral ambiguity in that the character was at times willing to do some horrible things, but somehow just about stayed on the right side of like, well, how they're going to manage that going forward, I'm not sure.
He was given the relatively straightforward, but in this case effective, plot device of his wife's sick. He's doing everything to save his wife. He's decided that in the post-pandemic world, this is what he wants to do and how he's going to hang on to his humanity. You know, it works as a simple, straightforward bit of characterization. You relate to the person who wouldn't do whatever to save their family, you know, at the end of the world.
Yeah, I mean, all the sped out characters, they did all unite a lot, both in the past and going forward. I mean, I guess at the end of the day, that's because it's planned by a writer. There does end up being quite a big sense of small world coincidence. Everything's connected in this show. Everyone meets everyone, everyone ends up being connected to everyone, even though they're like miles and miles away from each other. At the end of the day, it's, you know, at least it makes me feel like there's a plan.
Yeah, and it means that nothing feels superfluous or like nothing's just kind of padding or like fleshing out the world. It's all connected to the plot, which helps it be that feeling of it's well paced. I mean, your mileage from this may vary, and this is definitely a thing that I've had disagreements with people in discussing shows. But to be honest, I lean on the side of I don't mind a smattering of coincidence if it leads to a engaging, you know, fast moving, well paced plot. I'm more willing to suspend disbelief in that regard. Again, like say, your mileage may vary, but I thought that worked well.
Yeah, no, I don't think it was really a problem. It just happened quite a few times. It seems like they're going to try and do a scientific explanation for all this, or at least they keep pretending there's a scientific explanation for all this. I'm curious if they're actually going to try it, because so far it seems like it's mostly just fairy tale magic.
Yeah.
I look forward to the pseudoscience explanation for why all the hybrids are different animals and stuff. It's very strange.
Yeah, hopefully it's not too hand-wavy, but I would actually prefer it to have a somewhat magical explanation, because I don't want a ridiculously detailed scientific explanation or something that basically even me with my A-level sort of straight GCSE knowledge of science can go, that's bullshit.
Yeah, I don't know. For a show where a lot of the tone seems to be kind of fairy tale-y, it's interesting that they keep occasionally pivoting back to, but the science, I guess. If they're setting it in the modern world, it's hard to completely avoid that aspect, and especially if they're also playing up the pandemic stuff.
Yeah, and the pandemic stuff, I think, was one of the things I did really like about this, in that it felt like the first piece of media I felt really engaging with the pandemic in like a plot way, and it didn't feel tropey or exploitative or just kind of shoehorning in something that's topical, in that, they had lots of people wearing masks and things like that, and it just had this kind of feel of, I don't know, authenticity, I guess is the only way to describe it. It's more than just the masks, the general sense of chaos and panic. There's one bit which I thought worked really well, which in the last episode, this isn't really a spoiler, it's in a flashback to when the virus is breaking out, and Tommy, aka Big Man, who's also referred to as, takes his wife who's pregnant to the hospital during the pandemic, and the hospital says at first, no, we're at capacity, we're not admitting people for anything. And there was a lot of talk, especially in the early stage of the pandemic and during the two big spikes of cases we had in the UK, that was a lot of what the talk about was in the media and in the sort of government. There was a lot of saying that the real danger of a pandemic is that when the hospitals get so full that people who have non-pandemic related medical problems can't get treatment. So when you have a heart attack, you call 999 and they say all the hospitals are full of COVID patients. You're going to have to basically fend for yourself. That was basically the point when that was the breakdown everyone was frightened of and everyone was working to prevent. And they managed to weave that relatively complicated point about hospital capacity as the real threat of the virus, or one of the main threats of the virus. It's quite a complex thing, but I did like how they took that and, using a straightforward piece of fiction drama, made it really accessible. They're in a rush, someone's having a baby, the hospitals are full because this disease has just ripped through the population and nothing's been done to stop it. And it really did make the kind of political debates that we've been talking about for the last year vividly accessible through fiction, which I really liked.
The few interviews I've heard or seen of this suggested that it was, I mean, obviously the comic is, I think, a good 15-20 years old and did feature a pandemic, so it's not as if this was made up to be current. But yeah, I think this was mostly underway pre-pandemic, but I would be interested how much of, especially like the last episode stuff you mentioned, was filmed post-COVID, because a lot of it was quite, I don't know, seemed to be invoking a lot of COVID stuff. There was a lot of visuals of things like masks and using words like wave, which seemed very from our COVID experience. But I guess possibly, maybe they just did their research. Maybe it's just that those are words that I've only learned in the last year and a half.
Yeah, there was a lot of talk in the background of like a second wave is coming. That was, if anything, that was the most triggering part of the show. Distinctly remembering that kind of brief moment of freedom we had towards the end of last summer. And then the rumblings in the background of people going, a second wave is coming, a second wave is coming. So yeah, that was quite intense. And I mean, yeah, I can't really shed any light on whether hospital capacity issue, I mean, I'm sure it's something people have been aware of in the past, and if you do your research, speak to pandemic experts, people who are in health planning, this is the sort of thing they'll be able to talk to you about. But it goes to show that the show is definitely engaged with the right issues when it comes to pandemics, has done its research, and is also using fiction to explore these complicated things, like kind of, in many ways, that 1 30-second, maybe even 1 minute bit of that one episode of Sweet Tooth is the most powerful argument for lockdowns I have seen since the beginning of the pandemic, because it's so accessible.
Yeah, and it's worth stressing, this show is not an endless constant bummer. Like, very deliberately, as we say, a lot of it is quite uplifting and green and lush and magical. But yes, there's also a few flashbacks to the grim pandemic stuff, just as contrast against it.
Yeah, but then again, there's the music and the kind of green tone and the rural setting for a lot of it. Yeah, it's kind of counterbalancing the grimness. So yeah, it balances the two well. It doesn't seem like too much of one or the other. There was one thing about the show I really, really didn't like, that I must say, and it's not a big thing, and I would recommend it, but it has a voiceover that is just utterly pointless. It's just this kind of gruff all-American talking in broad platitudes that add nothing to the story. Go like, sometimes fate knocks at your door, and do you answer? Yes, because it's a TV show.
Yes, because it might be my Amazon delivery. Yeah, it's It's one of those things which can be useful in the first episode. I mean, not entirely, because I just said earlier the first episode didn't entirely work for me. But it works for the first episode because they need to jump forward quickly, and it's useful to link that stuff with narration, because they were covering like most of Gus's life in a short space of time. But then it's in all the other episodes as well. And he just does a couple of lines of platitudes at the beginning and a couple of lines of platitudes at the end. And yeah, why did you saddle yourself with this? Why couldn't you have found some other way to do the first episode and just not bothered with it?
I do agree with Robert McKee on the pointlessness of voiceover. I think sometimes it really does work. There are notable examples, like Peep Show being the earlier example, where voiceover can really add something to a story. But generally, voiceover, 80% of the time, it probably could just be done differently and, done differently and better. And this is a great example of where voiceover adds almost nothing apart from slightly pretentious platitudes. It really reminds me of Heroes. Heroes was worse because, that went on for ages, and each episode began and opened with a kind of really pointless voiceover of going like, what is fate? What is the world? Is fate coming to the world? I was like, I don't care, get to the story.
Yeah, I must admit, the voiceover is a bit of it didn't work, but thankfully there's so little of it in episodes past about episode 2, I was mostly able to just ignore it.
Yeah, but I would not let that put you off. It's an interesting show. It's kind of, if you're sick of grim dystopian science fiction, then this is different, and it kind of does do a good job, I think. I managed to convince myself during the purposes review that it does accurately balance the kind of darkness and the upbeat bits to make an entertaining show. Finally, this episode, we will be discussing Solos. This is a series of 7 short films from Amazon Prime, each focus on one actor in one location, set in the near future and exploring the role of technology in our lives. The Solos include Anne Hathaway, Morgan Freeman, Anthony Mackie, and Uzo Aduba. We've seen all 7, so Nick, what did you think of them?
To use yet another MFV catchphrase, well, I think specifically a me catchphrase, I think we're in interesting failure territory here. It's a fun concept, and they've definitely really worked that Bezos money to get a big name cast, When you start with, we need some actors to deliver these monologues, and end on Helen Mirren and Morgan Freeman and Anne Hathaway and Captain America. I feel like you've definitely got a budget in there somewhere. But yeah, I just found them a bit half-baked. I found the writing kind of superficial and far too willing to just leave it as this character has emotions about their family, the end, without really going on a journey or giving us that much more. I spent a large chunk of these episodes kind of fighting back the desire to just fast forward to the final 5 minutes just to see if anything happened. And often I'd have been disappointed anyway because they just kind of wandered off. There's a couple, which I will name specifically in a second, which I thought were genuinely pretty good and actually had a journey and a plot and an ending, but they are very much kind of in the minority, to be honest. I can't argue with the talent involved, but yeah, this as a program or story or venture or whatever did not entirely work for me.
That's interesting. I think I had a more positive experience of this than you did, in that overall I kind of like the consistency and the feel of it. One of the main points I've got is that unlike most anthology shows, this is one of the few I can say that I don't think it was hit and miss, in that I felt there was there wasn't one that I thought was terrible or could be easily dropped. And there was a consistent theme and feel. Obviously, the talent, as you said, was very good. I kind of felt each one was more of a dive into a character. So some of them were more like a story, like an event was taking place. And in that case, there was a sense of progression. And those were probably some of my more favourites. There was almost there was a story unfolding. Some of them were more just taking a character and kind of just describing the character through dialogue. Although these are solos, a lot of them are talking to people on the phone or artificial intelligences, so there's usually some sense of dialogue. So they tend to be more kind of character pieces. But yeah, I do agree with you that, like a lot of these kind of single character things, it could be shorter in the sense of once you realise what the deal is, that's kind of it. I guess if they were just 10 minutes, it would have probably been not enough, but there you go.
I don't know, but I like the Anthony Mackie one, the second one where he's talking to his robot self. And by the way, this isn't really a point of critique, but the fact that almost none of them are really solos did eventually feel a bit like cheating. But anyway.
There is that element, yeah.
Yeah, I sort of felt like once I got the sci-fi premise and realised that he loved his family, which did not take that long, I felt like the remaining 10-15 minutes of the episode that were still left after that didn't really offer me much. I don't know, maybe it's possible I'm just dead inside. There is that option. But it was after that, it was just a man giving a loving description of his family. And yeah, I don't know. I wasn't really sure what it was telling me, other than that Anthony Mackie can act and that the man could write an evocative sounding description of a standard sounding family.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I liked about that was just the great performance of Anthony Mackie. There isn't much more to it than that, I suppose. What the whole thing did sort of remind me of is, if you ever go to if you have a friend who's been to acting school or, or for some reason go to acting school things, but that they do at the end of the course this kind of presentation, which is usually a series of short monologues and scenes from plays. And obviously a lot of them are just short bits. It's not about plot or necessarily character. It's kind of just a showcase for the talent for agents and casting directors. And the whole thing did kind of feel a bit like that, in that the Anthony Mackie story by itself, it's not really an electric story. What makes it great is it really shows Anthony Mackie's range as an actor, starting off playing this character as an arsehole, and at the end quite sympathetic. So it did almost feel a bit like a show reel or a performance exhibition. But the problem is, because these people are all super famous, it kind of undermines it. Because we don't need a showcase of Anthony Mackie's talent.
Well, exactly. Well, it is that, yeah, as well. The main way in which this is impressive is the performances, and they've undercut the amazing surprise a little in that regard by hiring a bunch of people who are clearly incredibly famous for giving amazing performances.
Yeah.
There were a couple of people I hadn't heard of before. I wasn't familiar with Nicole Bahari, who did was it penultimate one? The one with the person alone in the house with a kid.
Yeah, and that one had more of a plot to it. I quite liked the creepiness of it, but I felt it kind of resolved itself incredibly quickly.
On the one hand, I liked that it had a plot. On the other hand, I didn't like that it still didn't have an ending. So, yeah, a bit strange. But yeah, to try and pull myself out of this spiral of complaining, I'll mention the ones I did like. I thought the first one with Anne Hathaway was pretty good. That put me in an upbeat mood for the start of the series, which then dissolved. But yeah, I thought the first one with Anne Hathaway was an interesting premise and an interesting plot. And even though it was a massive cheat of the Solos concept, it did at least have content and story, and I thought the way it managed its reveals was quite good. As well as the fact that it actually had an ending, it actually leaked the reveals about the character through in a way that was quite interesting, and the reveals weren't that obvious. The problem with the slow reveal that Anthony Mackie isn't an arsehole is that, I don't know, he didn't seem that much of an arsehole to begin with, and it seemed like quite a small development from being an arsehole to also loving his family. Whereas the Anne Hathaway one, I thought, revealed more about the character in a more interesting way.
Yeah, I've chosen two I thought that really stood out, and I would say that the Anne Hathaway one could be my favourite or my joint favourite, in that I thought, it had a plot that worked together. It had twists. There was a clear sense of progression. There's also a character journey as well as a plot journey. It wove science into the show as well. And Anne Hathaway is a great actress. Also, really like how the show wove technology into the plot. So I've always felt that the technology things they're exploring were always there to serve character. Some other sci-fi based technology exploring anthology shows we could mention, sometimes you do feel like they've got some tech they want to explore and an idea for a plot, and the character is just kind of bolted on. I always felt that the interesting thing about science fiction is not cool stories about technology. I mean, that is some people's bag, fair enough, but what I like about science fiction is how cool stories about technology can be used to explore character, setting, theme, and I thought they all did that quite well, and the Anne Hathaway one especially.
It also made it a lot easier to cheat on the Solos thing.
Yes, by having robot Anthony Mackie turn
Robots, up. AI assistants. Basically, everyone who's talking to someone else is talking to some kind of tech.
Yeah. But it didn't feel shoehorned in. It did feel that they was usually using it to drive character forwards.
Which I guess is apt for a show made by Amazon, the creator of Alexa. But anyway,
that's a good point. Yeah, they're not going to go full Black Mirror where Alexa turns out to be evil.
Yeah. I guess they do in one of them. I guess spoilers. Although, I guess even in the one where Alexa is semi-evil, it's more the creators of Alexa that are evil. Wait, that's worse.
I don't think they've really thought this one through.
But it is basically an anthology about people alone talking to advanced Alexas.
Pretty much, yeah.
With the exception of the last one, which has two people in it, and just the Solos concept just dissolves. But yeah.
One of them is Dan Stevens from Legion, which was nice to see.
Yep, again, a man who I did already know could act, but he is good here as well.
That is true. The other of the solos that I really did like was the fifth one, which is the one called Jenny, with Constance Wu.
Yep, snap. That was my second one, Spotlight as well.
Okay, I'm glad we're aligned on that, because that one was the solo was a character telling a story, which I'm surprised they didn't use that as a format more often. If you're going to have solos, monologues, you can just have a character telling a story about their own life.
Well, yeah, I mean, that was a classic sort of Alan Bennett-y talking head monologue, wasn't it? That was just someone talking entirely honestly to camera. And to be honest, watching that one, and as you say, I really enjoyed it. I thought it was a really nicely told story with a really strong sense of the character. It wasn't just a character talking in general terms about their life, which was the thing that annoyed me about several of the others. But it was a very specific story, but it had a lot of touches that really brought the character across. And yeah, I thought that was great. And it kind of made me wonder why a lot more of the monologues weren't a bit more, I don't know, a bit more just straight to camera solo. Yes, giving them someone to talk to, even if it's a robot, makes it easier to write, but I feel like, or does it? I don't know. Or at least it makes it seem like you can write it more naturally, maybe. But it also creates this level of, I don't know, superficial lying that means the character isn't going to be fully honest, and then just means it becomes this sort of frustrating back and forth.
Yeah, they seem to be really committed to the idea of basically they want the solo actor to be able to talk to someone, because they seem to have this view that just like an Alan Bennett monologue, people aren't going to be into that, just one person talking.
No, incorrect. The Alan Bennett monologue was the best one.
Yeah,
Except
exactly.
Maybe
yeah,
the Anne Hathaway one, but I think possibly the Jenny one might have been slightly better.
Yeah, which just kind of blows their whole kind of conceit out of the water, which is that they always try to squeeze in dialogue wherever they could. There's so many ways you can do interesting one-person monologues, like why not a debrief? Like, an interrogation. There's so many ways you could just create situations where characters tell their story. A journalist interview, which doesn't even require the journalist to talk.
But that's what a lot of them were. I mean, the Helen Mirren one was just a Helen Mirren monologuing with, occasional, and then what happened? And what next? And why didn't you do that? Interruptions from a robot again.
Space Alexa.
Yeah, Space Alexa. And it just felt slightly unnatural again, because Helen Mirren was talking in big, flowery, literary terms that, I don't know, almost felt a bit strange for her to be speaking in when she was knowingly speaking to someone else. I guess she knew it wasn't a person, so it sort of works. And the Helen Mirren one it did not make my top 2, but it was not one of the worst ones.
No.
Possibly just on the strength of the fact that Helen Mirren is very good. But, I don't know. As you say, I felt they could have maybe toned down their desperate need to give them all someone to talk to.
Yeah. I kind of liked how they sort of weaved a sort of universe together, in that the Helen Mirren character is the daughter of the Anthony McKee character. The robot from the second monologue is on the cover of the magazine, is one of the props in the fifth monologue. There are some overlaps like that. There's probably more if you were really looking for them.
I wasn't sure whether any of the stuff about memory collection in number 5 and subsequent callbacks in number 7 were meant to imply something about all of them, like whether they were all people's recorded memories or something, but I don't think they were being quite that strict and cinematic university about it.
No, but yeah, it gave it a sort of nice consistent feel. Yeah, and I did kind of appreciate those kind of overall kind of tonal similarities, which is one of the things that I think stopped it being hit and miss like a lot of anthology shows. And also, I mean, as you said, this is made by one of the world's biggest tech companies, if not biggest tech company, Amazon. So, it may not be a shocking revelation to say that this is not a show about dark side of technology and people losing their humanity to tech in the way that, say, Black Mirror is. Don't want to lean too heavily on the comparisons, but it's the most obvious comparison to reach for. There is something, as we were saying about Sweet Tooth, I am kind of tired of future sci-fi dystopias, and this fact that this was a tech sci-fi show that wasn't all dystopian. In some ways, there were ways about how technology can be enhancing their lives, or more the fact that how technology can just be a background feature of characters' lives, exploring and revealing character and plot, I thought worked quite well, because it's not just the same old kind of what-if phones, but too much.
Yeah, I know people give Black Mirror shit for, I don't know, I guess it's try-hard bleakness, the old too much phone or whatever, but I don't know. There's an extent to which I feel like this almost went the other way and became slightly toothless Black Mirror, but yeah.
It did not have the biting intensity of Black Mirror, and especially as this has like absolutely top of the line people. Although like Black Mirror's getting bigger and bigger names now, it's on Netflix, including Anthony McKee. Yeah, exactly. He's got his sideline in dystopian tech things, especially as he was also in Altered Carbon.
He's a fan.
He is a fan.
Or maybe those are just the sort of roles you get offered after you become famous for doing nerd shit, who knows.
Yeah, there's a possibility. But he's very good in these roles. Again, also Outside the Wire, another tech-based sci-fi sort of dystopian thing that he was in, the film that's on Netflix and is worth watching. But I did like the fact that this felt he was doing something different with a kind of show exploring the role of technology in our lives, because, like I say, I'm just like, just from a a fan perspective or, a kind of artistic perspective, I am kind of tired of the tech dystopias. I know that there's a lot of issues involving technology and politics that need to be explored, and exploring them through media and culture is an important way to do that, but there are ways to explore technology and politics that are not just endless grim cyberpunk tech dystopias. So at least this and Sweet Tooth did something different, which is kind of the thing I liked about both of them the most.
It's true. Although to make another comparison to Sweet Tooth, I didn't think the pretentious voiceover at the start of this worked either.
No, that's true. But that's, again, the pretentious voiceovers are pointless.
Yeah, I mean, it was only one line per episode, so whatever. Bigger things to talk about, but nah, mate, nah.
But no, you are completely right there.
But yeah, I mean, these are completely standalone, so if you have half an hour free of an evening and want to watch the Anne Hathaway one or the Constance Wu one from this, I do genuinely recommend those two, for whatever it's worth. They're quite good as little self-contained, vaguely sci-fi short films. Although, to be honest, the Constance Wu one doesn't really even have that much sci-fi in it.
Yeah.
But I personally would not fully recommend sitting down and watching this whole show. But it sounds like Alistair might, so take my opinion however you normally take my opinion.
Well, yeah, you pull out number 1 and number 5, they're good. I mean, yeah, if you're looking for something that's only 20 minutes to half an hour, they're good. This seems like an interesting project because it's clearly obviously been done as a thing that can be done during lockdown, and high-profile people, I guess, are available during lockdown because it's always one performer on set. This might be one of those things that, if we do, touch wood, return to normal, this is a sort of weird aberration that just exists as a marker of this time and then disappears. I don't know if they'll ever do a second series of solos. Doesn't seem like much point if, it wasn't a resounding success, and the need to make this sort of stuff might disappear. So, but who knows? Yeah,
it doesn't seem like this has made much of a splash. I mean, it's dropped about a month ago at this point, and we've just got round to covering it, and I haven't seen anyone talking about it. So, yeah. Okay, and that was Moderate Fantasy Violence for this fortnight. Thank you very much for listening. If you want still more Moderate Fantasy Violence, you can go to moderatefantasyviolence.com, where you can find our old episodes, other sundry audio clips, and various articles, including, coming up very soon, Alistair's devastating long read on the entire history of the Mission Impossible franchise, complete with how it related to his life at the time. I proofread that the other day, and it's very entertaining, so stay tuned. That'll be going up in, I think, about a week and a half after this episode comes out. And if you've enjoyed all those experiences, then you can also go to your podcast app of choice and give us a nice 5-star review. Thank you very much.
If you want more from us, then you can follow us on Twitter, where we're at MFV Podcast, or you can find us on Facebook by searching for Moderate Fantasy Violence. If you want more from me, then you can find me on Twitter, where I'm at Alistair J.R. Ball, or visit my website at redtrainblog.com.
And I've been Nick Bryan. You can find out more about me and my work and comic writing and such at nickbryan.com, or by following me on Twitter as at nickmb. The next comics Kickstarter looms alarmingly close now, folks. It may even be bordering on imminent. So yes, follow me on Twitter now to hear more vague hints about that. Or come back in 2 weeks for the next episode of Moderate Fantasy Violence, in which we will be covering Luca, the new movie from Disney Pixar, and, because it's seemingly the thing everyone is talking about, we'll be taking a look at Bo Burnham Inside. See you then for those two things. Goodbye.
Bye. Oh, I didn't get my Loki joke in. I'm enjoying having a nice relaxing Wednesday. It's quite low-key. There you go. I'll see myself out.
Yeah, so we missed that.
Right. Okay, on to Solos, an Amazon Prime story.
It's all great material, wasted in the gaps between segments.
I don't know, it'd be good for the outro.
Oh, I see. That's what.
Yeah, let's just start it. Yeah, scripting outro bits loses all spontaneity.